So there's this figure in the early church that we Orthodox don't know well enough that we really need to know better. And this is St. Augustine of Hippo. St. Augustine was an incredible intellect, an incredible theologian, and an incredible saint. He lived at the transition between the 4th and the 5th century. He was a reader of the Cappadocian Fathers. He lived in North Africa. Right? He was born in North Africa, modern-day Tunisia. He was a Roman citizen. His father was a local aristocrat. He traveled to Rome and then Milan for his education and professional development. And it's in Milan that he actually became a Christian at the hands of St. Ambrose, who is another great, great Christian. You can actually go to Milan, in addition to the fashion and the food, you can go to Milan and actually see the spot where St. Ambrose baptized St. Augustine. Right? Like, it's hard for me to think of another place other than maybe Hagia Sophia in Constantinople where you could have two such unbelievably influential theologians actually met at a particular place in history, and you can actually go and see that exact place. And this is this place in Milan. Anyway, I digress. All right, so what's the story with St. Augustine? So St. Augustine, about 10 years after he became a Christian, wrote a book called The Confessions. And anyone who goes to a Catholic university cannot escape that university without reading the Confessions in about 5 different classes. And this is true at Fordham as well. You're going to read it in English, you're going to read it in history, you're going to read it in theology, you're going to read it in philosophy, and so forth. Because the book is truly unique in all of Christian literature. And for the first half of the book, he is recounting his kind of journey to conversion, to what impeded his conversion to Christianity and what ultimately led to his conversion to Christianity. His mother had been a Christian. She'd been trying to convince him to be a Christian his entire life. His father was a pagan. But he wasn't really that interested. He thought that the scriptures were kind of foolish. He didn't find them sufficiently philosophical. He thought that they were a little too anthropomorphic, meaning why would God walk in a garden? What kind of God actually walks in a garden? You know, he had these kinds of questions, especially about the Old Testament. But then a series of events occur, and I'm going to skip that. A series of events occur, and he begins to kind of see through the insights of St. Ambrose why actually Christianity is not only a sophisticated religion, but actually the most sophisticated religion. And he comes to pretty much embrace Orthodox Christian teaching as the true philosophy, the true religion. But the problem is that he's been living his life as a pagan, and he likes living his life as a pagan. He has a concubine. He has a child by her. He had other girlfriends before that. And he'd even begun to adopt some dimensions of what we would call Christian asceticism. Like he's learned to accept, you really shouldn't overeat, right? You really shouldn't get drunk. You really should, right? You should live a more temperate life. Like he's come to embrace some moral principles of Christianity, but not all of them. He's increasingly committing himself wholeheartedly to Christian philosophy. But when I say wholeheartedly, I mean he has abandoned any kind of secular career. Right? He's going to, now he has money so he can do this, but he's going to dedicate his entire adult life to thinking about God. And so when he's writing this book 10 years later, he's recalling this period in his life, and he remembers a prayer vividly a short prayer that he offered to God when he was kind of struggling within himself. And he prayed, Lord, convert me to yourself, but not yet. But not yet. And I share this passage with my students all the time because I say, this is potentially the most honest sentence ever written. Right? I mean, it just so genuinely speaks to our condition. We know what's right. We know one day we'll do what's right completely without gray. But we really don't want to do it yet. Right? Because we still live in this kind of bifurcated world where we still believe that happiness or pleasure or satisfaction is going to come to us through things other than the divine. Right? I mean, if we really did have absolute, unambiguous faith that God would give us every satisfaction, every desire that we had, then we would never rationally choose, to put off that divine embrace. But we all know, if we're honest, that every single one of us does postpone. We do. It's real. Right? And that's why I think, in contrast to many other things we read from Christian antiquity, that a passage like this reveals St. Augustine in many ways to actually be more real, and for all of his great intellect, more real and more human than many, many others. Right? And one of the things about the Confessions, and I really encourage you to read this book because it's just utterly fascinating. I have this assignment with my students, name the genre. Like, what is this book? And I make them do this because there's no answer, right? Because it's not a biography, it's not a confession, it's not a prayer, it's not a travel, it's not philosophy. What is I don't know what it is. I've been teaching it for 20 years and I still don't know what it is, right? But it's absolutely brilliant. Okay. So now what are we going to do with that? Right? I think we can all recognize that in some ways, whether we articulated it or not, we have all had that kind of Augustine moment. Right? We can all recognize that, yeah, I want to be a better Christian. I want to have faith. I want God to work in me. But maybe not quite yet. You know, I want to take that trip to Europe. I want to make another $100,000. I want to get a nice car, and I just got a nice car, so you know, I want to get a nice car. I want to do right. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can all do that. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us other than recognizing it to be true? Okay, and in kind of good Greek oratorical tradition, I'm going to make 3 points, right? Because Demosthenes says whenever you speak to someone, you should make 3 points, not more, not less. So I'm going with Demosthenes, all right? All right. First point, and it's a historical one. The historical point is that what a passage like this tells us is that the saints are actually far more like us and far more human than we realize. right? We tend to think of the saints as walking on water, right? Where everything they do is really, really easy just because they have faith and God inspired them and they are almost of a different caliber of person, that they have a different DNA that we will never have and we will never be able to be anything like them. And as a professional historian of Christianity, that's what I do for a living, I'm a historian of Christianity, I can tell you that the saints are far, far, far more like us than we realize. Right? Now, I'm not saying that we're all saintly, right? Because I know better, right? What I mean is we put them on a kind of pedestal and assume that they didn't have doubt, that they didn't make mistakes, that they didn't have struggles, that they didn't fight with their brothers and sisters, that they didn't sin. When in fact, the more you know about them, you actually realize that they actually, in many ways, are a whole lot like us. They did fight with their brothers and sisters. They did fight with their parents. They did sin grievously at certain times. But what differentiates the saints from us is that they were really, really, really honest with themselves. Right? And that's why a text like St. Augustine's Confessions is so powerful and so beautiful, because it really kind of puts out there before millions and millions of people, millions of people read this book a year, all over the world, right? All of his doubts, all of his failings, all of his despair, in a truly genuine and authentic way. Okay, so that's point number one, the historical point, that the saints are actually more like us than we realize. Okay? The second is more of a theological point, and it has to do with confession. Okay, and this, I think, puts us in the trajectory of how do we become more like the saints. All right? We have heard, those of us who grew up in the church, we have heard that we should go to confession. We've heard this since we were children. Some of us do it, many of us don't. Those of us who do it probably don't do it that often. And if we're honest, even when we do it, we hold back. Right? We hold back in certain ways. Right? Either because we don't want to say what can't be said to somebody else, or honestly, if we're really going to probe in a saintly Augustinian kind of way, it's because we are afraid to speak truth to ourselves. Right? Let me give you a slightly different take on what confession is about. Okay? And I'll let Father John correct me after I leave. Right? Confession is not about, all right, I did these 45 things, so I'm going to name them. And now that I've named them, I can walk out, and it's just like I've wiped the slate clean, and right, as though it's transactional. Confession is not a transaction. Right? It's not that I did bad things, I say this, now I'm good. Right? Now, sometimes we use that kind of language simply because we're trying to convince people to come to confession. Right? But that's not what confession is really about. What confession is really about is the encounter with the divine. Okay? Just like the Eucharist is about the encounter with the divine. Just like baptism is the encounter with the divine. Okay? And if confession is going to be an encounter with the divine, then it has to be a moment of genuine truth-telling. And we have, through our lives, whether we lived in the 2nd century or the 21st century, built an enormous number of impediments to genuine truth-telling. Because we have built an enormous number of emotional, psychological, spiritual impediments to actually knowing ourselves. Knowing ourselves authentically. Right? The most successful confession will be the confession that is risky. Because it is a moment of speaking that truth. I'm not saying to make something up. Don't misunderstand me. But a moment of speaking that truth of oneself for which you are actually genuinely afraid to acknowledge it. All right? Because acknowledging it brings self-doubt. It brings fear. And a whole host of other emotions. Right? So if we're going to learn, right, if we are going to learn from Augustine's Lord, convert me to yourself, but not yet, which he is saying years later as a reflection, as a kind of confession, right? He's acknowledging that there was this moment in his life when he felt this way, and then he moved beyond it. Okay? So my second point, which was the theological turn, was to offer you perhaps a different take on what I think is in play in confession. Okay? And my third point builds on the second. And it is about, okay, how then do you go from, Lord, convert me to yourself, but not yet, to, Lord, convert me, without the not yet. All right? And I think this has to do with the cultivation of the rituals that the church has developed for us, right? The ancients knew much better than we do now the connection between repeated action and perspective, right? You know this yourselves. The things that you do, whatever the things that you do in your life that you do over and over and over and over again, those repeated actions will shape who you are, what you do, how you see the world, how you're going to interact with people, and so whatever it is, whether it's work, whether it's exercise, whether it's children, whether it's caring for someone who's ill, whatever it is that you in your life have habituated, turned into habit, those habits directly inform how you view the world. Right? So why is it that the church gives us 3 services a week during Lent and 8 during Holy Week and another, and on and on and on? And why does the church give us fasting? And why does the church give us confession? And why does the church give us Eucharist? Right? It's not so that we can go without and be miserable. Right? Or to complain, or to kind of cram in more on our already overpacked schedule. Right? The church has done this for centuries and centuries and centuries because in the wisdom of the mothers and fathers who put this together, they are trying to habituate us to a life in prayerful community. How do we get from Lord, convert me to yourself, but not yet? It's not going to happen by some intellectual breakthrough. As much as I would love to say you're going to read one of my books and then you're going to come to church more, there is absolutely categorically no way that that's going to happen for anybody. Right? You are not going to become a better Christian because something has ticked off in your mind that, oh, okay, now I get it. Christ is three hypostases in one ousia. Or the Trinity is three hypostases in one ousia, right? As much as that is true, and there's reasons to believe it, that in and of itself isn't getting anybody to be a better Christian. Right? But having a prayer discipline where you get up in the morning and you say the simplest, shortest prayer for the benefit of your family, for your friends, for whatever you're struggling with. And you pray before, even if it's briefly, before your meals. And you say a prayer at night. Or you say a prayer with your children. Right? And you build on that. I'm not saying you go from nothing to 100 miles an hour. I'm saying you go from nothing to 5 miles an hour. And a year later, it's 10 miles an hour. And a year later, it's 15 miles an hour. And a year later, it's 20 miles an hour. Right? A long, slow, steady, committed habit of fasting, of the sacraments, of confession, of charity, right? The repeated action, the repetition of ritual, the repetition of habit, the repetition of prayer is what makes somebody want to be converted, right? It's like, has anybody ever, I'll give you the example. My wife just did a half marathon, right? I don't think she had ever run more than 3 miles in her life, right? So a half marathon is 13. And we're on video, she's almost 50, right? She's almost 50, and she basically went from 3 miles to 13 over the span of about 4 months, right? 4 or 5 months, which meant she had a regiment, she planned it out, she did it, right? And the whole thing. And by the end, she craved it. Right? Now, she hurt her hip at the very end, so she didn't, she wasn't able to continue it for a while right afterwards. But those last few months as she was training, like if she would miss a day for a business trip or something, she would, her body would crave because it had become so accustomed to it, right? Anybody who has ever exercised for a long period of time, it's the exact same thing, right? If you swim, and then you're not swimming for some reason, you miss it. It is absolutely the same thing with prayer. It is absolutely the same thing with fasting, right? Because we are preconditioned to be prone to habit. And there are good habits and there are bad habits. What you learn when you read the Confessions is that Augustine did not make the ultimate plunge and become one of the greatest saints in history because of his intellect. He made the plunge only in retrospect, when he realized that he had begun to adopt a kind of habit through the encouragement of St. Ambrose to the prayer life of the church. And his ideas about so many different things changed as his habit grew, because habits form our outlook, right? If you have an outlook, if you have a habit of prayer, you will expect different outcomes from prayer than someone who has no habit of prayer, but then is faced with a crisis. The person who has no habit of prayer and is faced with a crisis will say, "Oh my God, fix this." most likely God's not going to fix this. And then the person with no habit of prayer thinks God has failed to answer his prayer. Right? But another one of the great insights we learn from this book is that the person who has a habit of prayer doesn't pray to get something. The person who has a habit of prayer prays not for an outcome, but for a disposition to expect whatever comes. Let me say that again, right? The person who has a habit of prayer doesn't pray because they want A, B, or C. The person who has a habit of prayer prays so that they can be at peace with whatever A, B, and C might be. Do you follow? Because the disposition is one of constant conversation, constant communion with the divine. And when your disposition is one of constant conversation and constant communion with the divine, your outlook is not selfish. Right? And so forth. So, those are my 3 points, right? Those are my 3 riffs, so to speak, on this fantastic line from Augustine's Confessions. The first is that the saints are not so different from us except in their honesty. Right? The second is to not think of the confession of our sins as a transaction, right? But as a quest for truth-telling. And the third is that cultivating the habits of prayer, the habits of fasting, the habits of confession, and so forth, will, over a long, steady climb, give us actually absolutely everything we're looking for. Right? Because we will have made that transition from wanting to postpone conversion to actually welcoming conversion.